Afrikaner nationalist organization which had a symbolic or rather symbiotic relationship with the then ruling apartheid National Party. Recently, the organization celebrated 100 years. The organization has played a determining role in the political development of South Africa, and we're joined now by political analyst Piet Croucamp to talk about the role of the Broederbond in South African politics and what's called state capture. Welcome to Morning Live. Thanks for coming in.
Good morning. Thank you.
Welcome to the agenda, rather.
Thank you.
Let's just go back, and people wonder, what's the Broederbond? Because not much is being said about it these days. Who are the Broederbond and what have they morphed into?
Okay, just remember that they only have 1,500 members nowadays. They have 3,000 members, of which they say 1,500 are inactive members. So it's not an influential organization anymore. Whoever advised the president to go and speak at the Broederbond have either a very archaic view of Afrikaners or certainly don't have an understanding of the almost non-existent influence of the organization. That doesn't mean that they didn't have a particular history that had specific consequences for South Africa. Yes, they were enormously powerful. It was almost impossible to get anywhere, either in the state or in the economy, unless you were either a member of the Broerderbond or the sister churches, or buy into the narrative of the Afrikaner Broederbond.
What has eroded their power?
Well, certainly the change to democracy has eroded their power, but I think over the last 10 years, F.W. de Klerk, for instance, wasn't really a Broederbonder in that sense. So I think gradually their authority has diminished, and also you must remember that in the 1980s, 1990s, South Africa has become part of the global economy in a very, very fast way. You know, things happen very quickly. And that type of archaic systems become outdated easily. It was more important for whites at the time to become part of the global economy, to be successful business people, to become entrepreneurs, than to belong to a political institution. And you see it now, there's not a single organization in South Africa that can claim to represent Afrikaners. They're all very minority fringe elements, but the broad base of Afrikaners is not represented by any political leadership. It's because they have emancipated out of that archaic type of view of leadership and political institutions.
I know you say the advice to speak to them might have been misplaced, but President Ramaphosa has been a trade unionist, an employer, and he's now in government. He must have some sense of their, even an inkling of their remaining significance. What could that be?
No, there's absolutely nothing. I think he tried, it was the idea of a symbolic gesture. You'll remember that Nelson Mandela, for instance, went to Orania and he spoke to Mrs. Verwoerd.
And he spoke to the Broederbond.
And he also spoke to the Broederbond, but I think that was call it a degree of significance to the extent that with Verwoerd, who was the so-called architect of apartheid, because I think there are other political leaders that also creatively designed apartheid. It wasn't only Verwoerd. But you could go as a symbolic gesture to Verwoerd's wife, for instance. Yeah. But what do you get out of speaking to the Broederbond in 2018? Nothing. There's nothing symbolic about it. They don't represent any institution.
So in your view, if a president wanted to reach out to the Afrikaner constituency, who are the people to talk to in 2018?
No, you don't talk to anybody. What you do is you go to Ellis Park when they play a rugby test against England, and you shake Erasmus' hand, and you walk up to Beast and you say hello to Beast. And because the people sitting in the stands are all Beast fans, even if they're white and Afrikaners. Yeah. That's how you reach out to a broad spectrum of Afrikaans-speaking people. You certainly don't do it by going to a fringe organization.
So what was the point to this meeting? When President Jacob Zuma went to court, his followers made sure to bring this up time and again, that we have a president who's talking to the Broederbond while we're trying to talk about land. What was the point?
Well, I think also for the Broederbond, I think that the first point they put on the agenda when they spoke to the president was land. And just to show you how outdated they are, they were extremely disappointed after the meeting that the president didn't give them a clear, call it blueprint of what will happen to land. But it doesn't work like that in democracy. In democracy, you go to parliament, there are public involvement, it's a long process, and the conclusion is almost rubber stamped by the president, but the president don't impose a land policy. They were disappointed that the president didn't say to them, listen, we will not take anybody's land in South Africa. I have made that decision. It just shows you that that almost backwardness of the way that they think about democracy. They have not adapted to the ideals of democracy and the rituals and the processes, because they think that a strong leader can do something. The Broederbond was about strong leadership. Democracy is about strong systems, not about strong leadership. And I think that's why they, to a certain degree, left the president during that meeting rather blue.
So the one thing that meeting brought up was making parallels between the Broederbond of yesteryear and the state capture conversation of 2018. And you say that state capture is not a new thing in South Africa. Well, what do you mean?
Yeah, it's certainly not a new thing, but there's a little bit of a myth about state capture. State capture is when certain strong individuals within the entrepreneurs, within the private economy, establish relationships with cadres or with bureaucrats or the political elite in government, and then that gives them a monopoly or a benefit or an advantage within the private economy. The Guptas could compete in the mining sector because of their relationships with the political elite and with bureaucrats. Apartheid wasn't the same thing. They occupied the state, and then what they do is they occupy the economy. So they saturated the whole agenda. But state capture is inevitably a form of corruption, but not all forms of corruption is state capture. So if there's money stolen, say for instance by cadres within government, it's not state capture. It's only when somebody from outside, quite often not related to the liberation struggle, from outside the state, build a relationship with political elite in an effort to protect a monopoly or to establish or embed a monopoly in the private sector. That's what state capture is about. If we broaden that concept to include everything that was ever corrupt, politically, morally, etc.,
could be problematic.
Judge Zondo will find it impossible to investigate it.
A story broke out at the weekend, a report that said that Transnet needed to look into some officials and their links to the Guptas. Would that be an example of state capture?
That's state capture. I think that's a known example of state capture. I think virtually everything that the Guptas was involved. Remember, they were private sector individuals. They weren't part of the state. They weren't part of the liberation movement. They established business in South Africa, and then they tried to give themselves a benefit to maintain a monopoly or to establish a monopoly. In other words, they want the mining rights. They want a cheap coal. They want all the things that they could get in an effort, or expensive coal. They want all the things to establish a monopoly in the private sector. That's one of the examples where the private sector and the state link up to each other to corrupt the treasury and call it the distributive patterns of the state, the distributive regime of the state. In other words, how the state must distribute its resources. That's corrupted by a link within the private sector and the political elite.
Is there any role for Broederbond going forward in democratic South Africa?
No, nothing. They have a little bit of a fund, a reserve fund. They pay themselves salaries out of that. They collect a little bit of money, and I think eventually they will just disappear.
Just a quick one before you go. Eskom, they offered a 0% increase to their employees, and now they've come back to say, let's relook at this and let's talk.
It's because of political pressure. If you act as a destructive force, and unfortunately unions in the past have used that capacity, their destructive capacity, to force business or government into certain positions. The fact is, Eskom is highly overpaid, right from the last worker up to the bottom. They're all overpaid. There are too many people working there. The country can't afford it. That's why we, as the taxpayer, have to back that thing up. And unless they resolve that type of, it's also a form of corruption. If people are overpaid to the degree that they are overpaid and they are employed to the degree they are employed, they shouldn't be there. The efficiency of the system will collapse under that type of weight. Unless the minister has interfered there and in an effort to get some form of agreement, but the fact is, what they do to South Africa is almost immoral.
Piet Croucamp, thank you so much for your time. Piet Croucamp is a political analyst, and he was talking to us about developing political conversations in the country. Now, 3 people